Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The regular meeting of the Grosse-Ile Township Planning Commission will come to order. Would you all please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? First item of business, any additions and or deletions to the agenda. The agenda is very focused tonight on only one thing, primarily the Bayview presentation, that a result of the subcommittee work from a couple of weeks back. Any other additions or changes? Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda as submitted. Motion from Eric, support. Support. Steve, call a question. All in favor? Aye. Aye. Motion carried. Thank you. Next item is the review of the minutes from June 19. Were there any comments or questions or concerns regarding those minutes? Dan? Jay?
No, sir.
Steve?
No.
Jim?
No.
Eric?
No.
Huda? No. Entertain a motion to approve as submitted. Motion from Eric. Support? Support from Jay. Call a question. All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carried. As usual, Lori, very good job. Thank you. Can always count on you. Next item is public comment. Given that there's no one in the audience, we will proceed to the first item of business, which is the Bayview presentation. I think rather than giving you an introduction on this, because I'm gonna pass this straight off to you, Brian, and let you fill the whole group in on this as to where we are and where we're going.
Just with a couple of summary points, and then I have the draft ordinance up here as well, so we can kind of scroll discuss the handful of changes that we're proposing. So just to take kind of a step back and kind of refresh everybody, I think for the most part everybody has been here for some element of discussion on this particular topic. Been working on this off and on for the better part of the past year now. Came to our attention after a couple of inquiries from residents that the waterfront properties on Bayview Drive contained, anecdotally at the time, quite a bit of nonconformity. So we had some issues with whether it was setbacks or lot coverages or detached accessory buildings in yard locations. Just started to accumulate some evidence demonstrating that maybe there were some inconsistencies between our zoning and how this particular actually developed. Once we sort of identified that, we pitched to the full commission the idea of studying the neighborhood in a little bit greater detail to find out really the level of nonconformity that we were dealing with and whether or not any changes were appropriate or whether it was really within a level of tolerance, if you will. I think you guys have heard me say this before, whether it was this project, whether it was previous projects, it's very difficult to completely eliminate nonconformity from a particular neighborhood. You can do it, but I like to study it before I ever recommend that you do actually do that, because sometimes you'll set the bar so low that you basically take away regulation from a neighborhood just to make things conform. And that's not really the intent. The idea was to find a level or a percentage of nonconformity that we could tolerate. Can we lower the bar just a little bit and allow people in this neighborhood to develop, redevelop, like most people in other neighborhoods can, rather than routinely forcing them back through the channels of Zoning Board of Appeals for multiple variances, or essentially just having them walk away from projects once they find out that it's outside of the ordinance. So what we did was we identified our study area, which I'm going to go back and forth just a little bit here. I did not incorporate the maps into this. So
Brian,
yeah.
Just keeping in mind that we often get complaints that residents can't hear our programming, and we do have a problem that springs from Comcast. if you could raise your mic and try to speak more directly into it, it'll pick it up a little bit better.
Fine. It's as high as it goes, though.
Okay, sorry.
I'll do my best. I can lean in if I have to, make sure everybody hears me. I don't usually have trouble being heard, so
Podium can be raised as well.
I've got it as high as it'll go. So that's okay. I'll lean in a bit.
It's not for us, it's for the people at home who
Understood.
can't pick up what's going into the microphone.
Understood. So, so this is a quick shot of the neighborhood that we're discussing. So basically, we're on Lower Hickory Island. I have this oriented such that north is to the left, and you can see the East River side, which roughly 7-8 years ago we studied in a very similar fashion. And ultimately found that we needed to create an entirely new zoning designation to adequately address the development patterns of that neighborhood. So we've taken a similar task with the Bayview side, which if I can get this to work, so essentially looking at this area here with a focus on the waterfront properties. So I want to make that clear too, is that at this time, the internal lots on the Bayview side really have a much stronger representation of their current zoning, which is R1B, and we do not have the narrow lots, smaller lots. We don't have the same circumstances that we have for the waterfront properties. So, and you can see visually, you can start to see some of those patterns just looking at this in terms of lot widths in particular. You look at 1, 2, 3, 4 homes, and then take a look at the waterfront side, and you see how much narrower these properties are in relation to those across the street. I know we don't have property lines on here, but I think you get the gist in terms of the density. So, so in total, there are 29 residences on the waterfront side, and in order to, again, try to see where we stood at this particular moment, we took all those lots and we studied them based on current R1B zoning designations, and we analyzed lot width, lot area, floor area ratio, and lot coverage ratio, which were the things that anecdotally, again, just based on a few inquiries, we started to see a bit of a trend and wanted to study it a little bit greater detail.
Brian, would you put that back, please, in presentation mode?
Yeah. Oh, psh.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for catching that. So to give you an idea, again, of the level of nonconformity that we're dealing with, 26 of the 29 don't comply with R1B lot width. 21 of 29 don't comply with R1B lot area. 13 are in excess of the maximum floor area ratio, and 12 are in excess of the maximum lot coverage ratio. So there is a level of nonconformity, I believe we found here, that was a bit above kind of the standard level that we would like to see, a little bit above and beyond. And there is no magic number. I can't tell you 10% versus 50%. The idea being we want to try to reduce as much of it as we can, make life a little bit easier for these residents to pursue redevelopment opportunities or future renovations without, again, setting that bar too low. If we just simply wipe out floor area and lot coverage ratios, well, okay, now they're all conforming, but now you can build on 100% of the lot, and that's not the direction that we want to go. So our target was not to seek out 100% compliance. Our target was to try to apply different zoning to improve the situation, but not to 100% eliminate the situation. So noticing that there were quite a few similarities to the East River side of Lower Hickory, our next task was to take a look at all of these parcels in relation to the R1F zoning. Yes.
So Brian, can I ask
Of course.
here real fast? So I just want to get reminded of the problem statement, because I know that when we did the Hickory Island Association aspect of this project, right, they were having a lot of issues in the ZBA.
Mhm.
So part of the problem statement was really trying to get them out of ZBA so that they could just do things naturally without having to go through that extra step, if you will. So this analysis right now looks like it's more of a, hey, we're trying to reduce nonconformities. So is it really that we're trying to reduce nonconformities, or is there something from ZBA that says, hey, we've got too many of X, Y, and Z cases at ZBA, and that's what we should be addressing?
No, originally this started because we had 3 or 4 applications within a very short period of time that were all headed to ZBA. And ultimately, I think 2 or 3 of them backed out, and 1 or 2 of them kind of modified their plans and really reduced the scope to comply, just so that they wouldn't have to go through that process.
It'd be nice to know what those, like, what made them stop, right? Was it the, was it LCR, lot coverage ratio? Was it
There was a lot coverage ratio, and I think the others were setback related and/or expansion of non-conforming residence related.
Okay, I just want to make sure we're addressing the right problem as we go through this.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, this one was not based on a case history from ZBA. This was something we sort of identified from some potential projects and from meeting with some residents about potential projects, and started to just piece the puzzle together, noticing that there was, in my opinion, in excess of non-conforming conditions for this particular neighborhood. So moving on. So again, our next step was basically, okay, let's identify what we're working with today. Next step is, well, let's take a look at sort of the next closest zoning designation. Let's apply those dimensions, and let's see what that does to impact this level of nonconformity. As you recall, with the R1F, there really wasn't anything comparable. So we had to basically create from scratch an entirely new zoning designation with all new standards. In this case, because R1F had already been created, we had the ability to simply apply R1F and see sort of where the chips fell. So in this case, as it relates to the detached accessory buildings, the yard placement is permissible under R1F zoning. In terms of the lot width, we go from 26 nonconforming to 7 nonconforming, so a pretty good improvement. In terms of lot area, we go from 21 nonconforming down to 9. Floor area, 13 to 8. And lot coverage, which I felt was probably one of the more important ones, was 12 to 1. So all of a sudden now, if we apply R1F, we've really improved the situation for these people in terms of existing conditions. And in my opinion, we're essentially setting them up to allow them to renovate, rehab, remodel, should they so desire in the future, without theoretically the need to go to ZBA or to come back to Planning Commission for overages on coverage ratios. So that was the next step. Based on sort of presenting this information to the full commission and then taking a more detailed look at it in terms of how this affects the ordinance itself, how would we have to amend the ordinance to sort of make this work. So I've been working with the subcommittee to try to get that together. So that is the material that's included in your package. And actually I've got, so this is just the summary that I put forth. I'll pull up the full draft in a second here. So Section 3.2, we've updated the intent of the R1F district. So as a draft amendment, I just wanted to make sure that we added, because it was written specifically for the East River side of Lower Hickory Island, and we wanted to make sure that we broadened it to indicate that this would in fact also be applying to the waterfront properties on Bayview, which are quite similar to those East River properties. Section 3.5, which is essentially the dimensional table.
Sorry, you got
Yeah.
one more question there. So there's a handful of houses on the non-waterfront side of that. So this is not addressing those properties. This is only addressing the waterfront side.
That would be my proposal. Yes. I don't think the internal lots share the same conditions based on what we've looked at so far. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but based on what we looked at, they were not reflective of going to R1F. And in all honesty, going to R1F because we're reducing lot size requirements, there was the potential, although we still have R1E overlay, but there's a potential, I think, to kind of alter neighborhood character a little bit too much on the internal lot side, because those lots are more reflective of current R1B standards. So I didn't really see the need to change those. So, yep.
If I might, maybe it'd be helpful before you move on to maybe expand a little bit on what you were just touching on, which is, if I'm sitting in a house that's currently non-conforming, and we make a change to make it conforming. So, I think it was lot coverage ratio went at 20% we had 12 non-conforming, and at 25% we have 1 non-conforming. If I'm in that 11 that switched from non-conforming to conforming, what does that mean to me as a homeowner?
So in essence, the difference becomes the ability to expand your residence if all other standards are met. So if you can still comply with setbacks, still comply with heights, then you'd have the opportunity to build an addition or expand without the need for further variance. It also ups so floor area and lot coverage are a little different than just setbacks. The way the ordinance is written, Planning Commission has some approval authority, but it's limited to 5% over the maximum. So in essence, what it does is it will potentially, there's going to be a few different effects. One of which would be those that are already over the 5% threshold that Planning Commission gets would now essentially be brought into compliance or have the ability to come before you as opposed to going for variance. Some of them might actually comply with an addition. So they would be brought into a ratio that's within that allowed by ordinance without the need for any additional approvals. And then it would also bring into play that if somebody is still, I think there's one outlier that was a pretty big number, but they would potentially have the ability to go to ZBA still if they wanted to do something above and beyond what they already have. But as far as the others go, it opens a door to come before Planning Commission or even just meet the ordinance without really public body approvals that they currently would not have. Hopefully that helps.
As far as accessory structures are concerned, maybe touch on that as well.
Yeah, so that one, so on waterfront lots, detached accessory structures are not permitted in the street front yard. This is a neighborhood that has 12 of them. So of those 29 homes, 12 of them have detached accessory structures in the street front yard. In R1F, any of you that have driven the East Riverside will notice that, well, that's all there are is street front detached accessory buildings. So for the initial proposal, if, again, we went to R1F for these waterfront properties on Bayview, the yard placement would now become compliant. So that would be one big nonconformity that we would be eliminating for all of them, essentially, for all 12. Now, the one hiccup you'll notice in my draft, and I presented this with the subcommittee, I'm still studying the sizes and setbacks in a little bit more detail, because to simply convert this neighborhood to the R1F standard, I think would probably go a little too far for those detached buildings, at least in my opinion. They're not all 2.5 car garages right up to the street like the East Riverside is. So if we were to just strictly apply R1F without any further modification, we'd be essentially allowing 900 square foot detached buildings in the street front yard with, I believe, 15-foot setbacks. That's not really reminiscent of how those buildings function in the Bayview side. So I'm still trying to come up with a better approach that I think allows them, because it's part of the character, as opposed to just flat out prohibiting them, but allows them so that they can stay and so that others could do similar projects in a way that doesn't just completely change the character of that neighborhood as well. So that's the one missing piece that, as I stand before you tonight, I still need to get that one sort of resolved to my satisfaction before I present it back to the subcommittee with my suggested solution. So that one, unfortunately, is still kind of hanging out there, but I will do my best to have a resolution before vacation, because I'd like to get this off my plate in as much as. So just getting back to track here. So section 3.5, I noted in my summary, and you'll see in the draft, there were a few different changes proposed to this. The first one was a simple typo item that I identified when I was preparing this. I actually noticed that the codified version of the ordinance has already caught this correction. So that's why I put the strike through in my presentation. So there's a reference to the footnotes to section 3.5 that the original version identified 10 footnotes, but in fact there were 11. So in that draft that you have before you, there was a simple correction from 10 to 11. However, when the ordinance was codified, they already caught that. So It's already been corrected. We don't need to have that as part of this particular draft. The second thing I did was to remove the rear yard setback requirement for the R1F district. And you saw my comment in there, and I said the same thing to the subcommittee, and that is because none of the properties where R1F would apply have a rear yard, all waterfront lots. So they have a waterfront yard and a street front yard, no rear yard. So in essence, for us to insert a 30-foot rear yard requirement to that district, I think it was just originally an oversight when we first applied it. But really, it doesn't have any impact whatsoever. I just felt. And then the third change is one of the bigger ones, because I mentioned that East River and Bayview are very similar. They also have a few key differences too. One of which I just got through with the detached buildings. East River, they're much larger and much closer to the roadway, so that's one area we have to deal with. The other, or the next one, is in terms of the waterfront side setback. So the way conventionally around the island waterfront setbacks work is it's a predominant shoreline average, so that when you basically look at a row of homes, there may be an outlier. One may be closer to the road, one may be closer to the water, but there's sort of a predominant setback line around that perimeter offset from the shoreline where you can identify, basically that's the point to which you have to stop building so that you don't impede, whether it's vision or whatever it may be. The idea is we don't want people building 20 feet closer to the water than their neighbors, so we're trying to protect those waterfront yards. The way the East River side does it is a twofold test, one of which is per the ordinance, which is the average shoreline setback I just mentioned. The other is that as part of the association rules for the East River side, they have a measurement where also not only do you have to meet the average shoreline, but you also cannot exceed, I think it's 215 feet. 215 feet when measured from the street front lot line. So if you think about street front lot line measuring all the way back towards the water, there's a hard line of 215 feet there where people cannot build any farther, any closer to the water than that. To apply that standard to Bayview just doesn't make any sense. It's not applicable. So when I wrote this up, I put forth kind of an exception that would dictate that Bayview would still be subject to the averaging, while East River would be subject to the averaging and/or. Again, trying to work within the existing language, but to make the distinction between Bayview and East River. The next two are similar in terms of trying to create a distinction between Bayview and East River. The first one, section 17.4A, this is under the waterfront structures. As you'll recall, this was actually a few years after we created R1F for the East River side. We had some follow-up meetings with representatives of the association, and they identified some areas of their own bylaws and rules that were quite contradictory to our ordinances. Particularly different types of structures, use of lifting devices. What we did was we basically incorporated those regulations as applying only to R1F. So if you look at 17.4A and 17.4C, there are specific prohibitions to lifting devices in R1F. There is a reduced illumination level for R1F, and there's also a prohibition on swimming pools in the waterfront yard for R1F. Again, those were written specifically for the East River side, so I tried to simply add in another exception statement to basically have an understanding that those more stringent standards would apply to East River, while the conventional standards would apply to the Bayview side. So I know we get to a point where, we have 2 or 3 kind of key distinctions, but I really didn't feel that it was necessary to go as far as creating a new district for this side, which is what we did with East River, because it's so different than anything else that we had under conventional zoning. So, what I've tried to do is take R1F and kind of blend it to match this neighborhood as well as we can, to account for some of the differences, but also then identify the similarities where they exist, and then apply those standards, which we feel are a little bit more in keeping.
Just to add that, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the reasons the lift devices came into play, if I recall years ago with East River, is they have their own yacht club or their own boat club, correct? So their thought all along was they could store their boats down the road and kind of leave the waterfront open. So it's very, very special for that district, where on the other side they don't have that. So it'd be kind of silly to not let them keep their boat in front of their house.
Yeah, and there, to that end, the I did look. You can actually see them in the aerial. I'll exit. There are at least 2 on aerial pools in waterfront. And that was something where that was a prohibition that was written and intended for the East River side, and we didn't necessarily want to apply that to Bayview as well. If we did, we'd be creating at least 2 new non-conforming situations, and from the start of this was to reduce non-conformity, not to add new ones to some of these folks. And these yards are a little bit different. There's on the East River side, there aren't any. So it wasn't as though we were taking away somebody's rights. They were disallowed or prohibited by bylaws, and there were, the time felt that was an appropriate regulation. Again, that's another one of the differences between how applying R1F would. So that's the gist of the draft. I did mention, and I put the notes in the draft that you have, that I still have to get the detached accessory building portion resolved. So that would affect section 19.11. That'll be another one where I've just got to accommodate for the differences between the 2 sides. Try to write that up in a way that is not overly confusing, but also is reflective of that neighborhood character. That's sort of the next big thing that we have to get settled. I will, as I mentioned, I will study a little bit further. I'll come up with some new language that I think addresses it, and then I'll present that back to the subcommittee, rather than just jumping right ahead to you all, because the subcommittee, I think it's been a good process to kind of let them vet some of my work before we bring it out to the full group.
Brian, have you any idea on timing on that?
I'd like, as I mentioned earlier, I'd like to sort of have my part of it done by end of year. I don't know if we can do that and squeeze a meeting in with the holidays forthcoming, but I'll reach out to the 3 of you and we'll see if you all can squeeze in some time. And if I can get a quick resolution to it, we can just do it by conference call. We don't necessarily set up a sit down over it. I can send it to you and we can just talk about it and get it. I just want to get it fine tuned to a point where you all are comfortable with it. Don't feel, the one thing you guys have been very good at is I can write a regulation to say anything, but at a point where it becomes confusing to the layperson, then it's not going to be an effective regulation. I know what I meant to say, and I know what the intent of it is, and I know what I think it says, but if it's going to simply confuse not only commissioners but also residents or designers, then it's not worth it at that point. And that's where the rest of the group knows the subcommittee's done a good job kind of reeling me back in when I take things a little too far. That would be my proposal for this process as well. So let's maybe the 3 of us can talk aside, and if we can get something settled before year end, great. If not, there's no reason it has to be, other than the fact it's kind of clean, just to try to get it done. we'll work on that. And then once we get through that point, you know, we've always talked from day one that a big component of this was going to be outreach to the neighborhood, to the residents that this would affect. So once we have a good grasp on the change that we want to propose to the detached accessory buildings, then we'll set up a forum and invite those residents. We'll notify them and have them come in and take a look at what we're proposing. We can look at each of their individual properties. I've got the spreadsheet with all of the dimensions, and we can look at their property and say, okay, here's where you are today, here's issue A, B, C, and here's what this proposal could possibly do for you. Correct this now, allow you to add on in the future, whatever the case might be. So that would be the next step after that. And once we get to that point, if we do get some feedback from the residents that result in some changes to the ordinance, I would want to make those, present back to subcommittee one last time, and then at that point we'd have a pretty fine-tuned draft number 2 or 3 that we'd like to come back and present to the Planning Commission. At that point, we're simply processing it for public hearing and your.
Brian, I think it might be wise to consider when we were talking about that step 2, public involvement with residents. Okay, yes, we have under item 5 a public hearing, you know, as required in the zoning ordinance, but you know, for example, the people that are living across the street from the zoning change potentially, you know, have a vested interest in it as well, and we want to make sure that we include those folks.
Sure.
Even the Hickory Island folks who now see their R1F zoning with different wording, you know, could conceivably want to come in simply to reassure themselves that they're not being impacted. And so let's think broadly about who we include in that step number 2.
Problem. Yeah, more the merrier at that point. I mean, the whole idea is number one, we don't want to surprise people. That's not how we want to do business. And number 2, I would rather present to them in a more informal fashion so that they get their questions answered and they understand what we're doing long before we get to a point of a public hearing. Because what we don't want to have is we don't want to have misinformation out there. We don't want to have people that don't understand what we're doing or why we're doing it. And I don't want to get flooded at a public hearing with a bunch of people banging their fists saying, what are you doing to my property? I want them to know long before we get to that point what we're proposing, why we're proposing it. So, yeah, we'll outreach to not only these 29 property owners, but the internal lots, and we'll also work with the East River side as well. So there's no reason we can't just, we can't invite more people to participate. So
I would like to, the next time our subcommittee gets together, have you lay out the specific plan. What are we exactly going to mail to people? How are we going to follow that up with communication to invite people?
Sure.
What exactly is the process to get the people involved? So if you would give that some thought, please, so the subcommittee can review it, I think that would be appreciated.
absolutely.
Is that something that is permissible with the GI app, that we can push out a notification that this is taking place,
Don't know.
sometime from now? And
But we need to explore all the options.
yeah, I mean, it's there. Put it out there.
I'll talk to Dale about that.
And Brian, you can also just put information out on the web page, on the announcements, first page of the website, grosseal.com. And I think the push notification might be good on the day of the meeting. It goes out to island residents to say there's a public subject if you're,
Yeah, that day, and maybe 1 week ahead of time.
I know I like the idea that, when you showed the overview of the island, okay, and what's impacted and what's not, I think, marking that on there, and a picture's worth 1,000 words.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, we'll run it like we would run a typical public, workshop, whatever we want to call it. We'll have boards and/or, I'll utilize, if we have it in this room, I can utilize the computer and the screens, and we can show, literally each and every property. I can have the GIS downloaded onto a map so that we can look at them individually, address by address by address. and start to, dig a little bit deeper on the individual property level impact as opposed to just,
Do we have an idea of, you had, that first slide you had opened up with of all those non-conforming properties? How many of those in the past 10, 12, 20 years followed the right process to obtain approval versus how many just went on their own?
No. Couldn't tell you. I mean, the lot width and the lot area, those have been in place for
Yeah, I'm thinking more of the structures.
the floor area lot coverage exceedance. That ordinance has only been in place for maybe the last 10 years. So my guess is that that those that are not currently in compliance probably were built. That's just my guess. And same for the detached. We've had a couple at ZBA over time, but I think a lot of them probably predate the regulations on those as well.
I think some of those lots down there and the buildings on them may even go back before R1B was created. I think there's just a lot of legacy there. At least I hope that's the case.
And again, I mean, these aren't major changes we're proposing, but it's it makes a lot more sense from where I sit and for what I do to have zoning that better matches the character of a neighborhood, as opposed to simply applying a zoning designation that, again, created quite a few nonconformities without much thought and quite frankly without a whole lot of problem. It's not as though this has been a major issue that we're trying to address. I think the East River side was probably a little more pressing because there was a bit of ZBA application at that time. There were quite a few, and you could see the geographic trend year over year over year. That's not necessarily the case here, but once we sort of identified a potential problem, studied it a little bit further, recognized it was a bit beyond our tolerance level, then we tried to identify a potential solution to hopefully help these homeowners in the future. And the best thing that comes of it is either it has no impact at all on somebody, or that maybe it allows them to implement a plan or an addition or a renovation that they've wanted to do but couldn't previously do, without going so far as to completely change the neighborhood.
It basically goes without saying that if you have an unrealistic zoning, it's not right to have to drive the residents in that area to ZBA. That is not a pleasant experience for people.
Including the ZBA members.
Yeah.
Right, Steve?
Okay, let's go around and see if anybody else has any questions or comments about the plan or what Brian has said. Dan?
Also, I think it's important that
Jay, you're part of the subcommittee, but I imagine you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I do. I'm certainly not gonna rehash what we've talked about in the subcommittee too much, but I think it's fair to say that I think from the beginning we've looked at this as, well, hey, if we can pick up a quote unquote easy win here, use some heavy lifting that was done previously on the East River side, gain some conformity without doing a whole lot of work and without causing new problems. Why don't we explore it? And that was kind of the spirit of what we've been doing all along. And I think it's fair to say that I think back to the principles of what we try to accomplish here, and that is to preserve what people think, or what people bought, so to speak. If I buy a house and it has certain restrictions on it, I know those restrictions are there, even if my neighbor has violated them, or those restrictions didn't exist when my neighbor built his structure. On the other hand, if I, buy, to build on Dan's point, if I buy a house and there's no garage in front of me, and it's prohibited by ordinance, and then we make it available, and now I have to look at a garage door instead of, some open space. I didn't buy that with that in mind. So it's something we need to keep in mind, and especially, when we think about the accessory structure rules, I think that's part of what you're struggling with. If we have, 12 nonconformities right now with accessory building, if we end up with 29 accessory buildings in the road front, that's going to change the nature of what's there, and especially if they're all 2.5-car garages, and you have passageways in between each garage. I think that changes things. So that's one I think, and I appreciate your kind of going slow with that one, because I think it's that's probably the one that's most likely to change the nature.
And that's nail on the head for that one. It's in waterfront yards. They're obviously waterfront lots in particular. Detached accessory buildings. The regulations are quite restrictive, and that's intentional. I mean, quite frankly, I think we're all well aware. So I am trying to be cautious, and some might suggest maybe a little too cautious, but that's how I would prefer to process this, because they're not exactly like East River. If they were all 2.5-car, story and a half, 10 foot off the street front lot line, then it'd be easy. But they're not, and I don't want to write a regulation that is, I would deem, pretty far outside of the character of that part of the community. So anyway, we're on the same page with that one.
Because it is such a mixed bag.
It is.
Some have none, obviously.
Correct.
Most have none.
Right. And I
some
think
have one that's up by the house. Some of them out by the street.
Right.
Some of them
And
more of a big shed, and some of them are a full 2.5-story or
So
2.5-car.
the reality with that is we need to look at it from all those angles, and if we can find a nice happy medium that allows some but not others, would allow some remodel, redevelopment, addition, but not something that's going to impact the neighbors, then I think we come up with that. Absent that, it may be something where we just continue forth, the prohibition. If we can't come up with a regulation that's going to maintain or promote, I guess, the same character in the future, then I would probably suggest that we continue the prohibition as it is currently. And then in that case, there's 12 people that have non-conforming detached accessory buildings. We've not made life any more difficult for them. We've not taken away rights that anyone else has. Simply maintain status quo on that if we're unable to sort of develop a sound regulation for that area.
That's all I have.
Thanks, Jay. Steve?
Sure, real quick. First, Brian, as always, thank you. I think you do a great job outlining the different items for not just the team in front of you, but everybody on TV and in the audience out there that are listening in. Second point, to a point made earlier, just as I like to remind people at the ZBA, so these meetings are all public. So there is always constant public notice going out there, whether one in the audience chooses to look at the TV, chooses to look at the website, chooses to look anywhere. There is always plenty of public notice for anybody to get involved. If Bayview residents wanted to be here, they could be here, whether you're waterfront side or non-waterfront side.
No further thoughts. Great work has been put in this so far. So thank you, Brian. And I guess I'm looking forward to the public hearing to make sure that we've crossed all our T's. So that's all I have.
Nope, nothing to add.
Well, just a real short comment. I do appreciate the fact that you're going to send out material that will make the people fighting understand that this is not something to create more difficulty for them, but rather that this is about making things, taking away hurdles as opposed to creating.
That was our intent from day one.
looking at all the detailed specifics of what exactly that structure or request is going to do to all the neighbors around it. And they're very good in making sure that, whatever that impact is, that it's positive or at least minimize negative. So, they're already performing that function. So if we simply default to them, that might be one of the easier ways to get around the problem. But in any case, Brian, as usual, great job, well organized, and I appreciate your presentation.
Thank you. And thanks to the subcommittee for their help getting us this far, and obviously the input everybody's had up to this point. This has probably taken a little bit longer than I originally had hoped, so that part's on me, and I'll apologize for that. But we will see this thing through, and again, the intent is, I think Uta said it best, it's not to be punitive, it's not to create more regulation. It really is intended to sort of mold a zoning district such that it's more reflective and representative of how this is not a blank slate. I mean, you can see there are, we're not talking about a lot of undeveloped land here. We're talking about all existing homes, and pretty big difference between current zoning and how these homes.
Very good, Brian. Why don't you just stick around up there, and you can give us
Absolutely.
the update on the projects that are out there, which is the next agenda item.
So we've had a few things. I think there's a couple that have been potentially on people's minds. I don't know. Maybe you guys don't stay up at night thinking about these things, but I certainly do. Imagine doing this in 15 different communities and having little things like that. Anyway, so the gas station at the corner, they obtained your approval back in June, and Lori has spoken with them not too recently, but not too far back, certainly since our last meeting. They're currently in works with engineering, so they're trying to sort out their engineering issues. If you'll recall, they were driveway approaches, overall stormwater management. So those are all things they're trying to work through now. They do have a year to pull permits from your approval, and Lori and I were just talking that given that the history of that particular project, how they came before us, and then there were long lapses in resubmittal or follow-ups, we'll probably reach out to them sometime this spring if they've not yet applied for permits to give them a reminder that their approval expires next June. They can request an extension if needed, but I don't want to send them the reminder after it's already expired. I want them to be prepared in advance so that if they have hit a bit of a hiccup but still want to pursue the project, then we'll have them request that if they're not going to be in time. One, we'll just keep you apprised as we go on that one. The other one, which we've had some limited amount of communication on, was the newest building on Macomb Street and the potential to change the first floor use of that building. We had originally set this meeting up tonight to not only go over Bayview, but also we thought we might have some more information on that project. So we've had a couple of administrative meetings with the applicant, or the owner now, and the owner's representative, and we thought they were going to have a little more progress, but we've not heard back from them. We did inform them well in advance that this meeting was scheduled. Had something new or something they wanted to pursue or discuss or present that we wanted them here tonight to get them. Don't know where that one stands beyond that. I know they're working on it, but I couldn't tell you. The new hangar building is under construction. You'll recall we had a sketch plan approval for that. Soon also, Lori? Okay, regardless. So that's underway, well underway. You'll recall that was probably a relatively minor project anyway, but one that is you did approve and is pursued and under permit. The only ones that I can think of off the top of my head. So if there's anything else floating around out there. happy to take them or look into it.
I have a question about the possibility of the cement plant.
Okay,
Have you heard anything further on that?
not a peep.
Okay.
Maybe, and I think Ute is aware of this. I don't know if the full commission is aware of that.
Maybe
but
you ought to enlighten them.
Yeah, so this was summer, fall, somewhat recently. The ties into the weight restrictions that were applied to really some complaints from contractors about their inability to bring one load of concrete batch over. So having to split up into smaller loads, which is driving up costs for people doing driveways or sidewalks or new homes, whatever the case might be. And we currently have basically what amounts to a prohibition on concrete batch plants on the island, even in our light industrial district, because of the potential impacts those uses. So there was some discussion kicked around about potentially amending the ordinance, looking into some other alternatives to potentially allow that to occur while these weight restrictions are in place. But there are some hurdles to that. As I mentioned, it's not allowed under your zoning ordinance, so that's a pretty big hurdle from where I sit. But I've not heard any follow-up from that last conversation, Mr. Chair.
This is not.
I'll reach out to Dale. That'll be something if it's anything, and obviously we'll look to Ute for some coordination on that too. If there is anything that the board wishes to pursue to that end, we'll make sure that we're up to speed and
Brian, anything since we had that conversation, nothing new has come up to the board either. There's no.
Okay.
For the rest of the commission, it was suggested to people in the building department that there might be a builder on the island willing to create or build a cement batch plant here in order to provide that service without having to use it. But that's really as far as I know as it's ever gotten.
Okay. Any other things in the wind?
not that I can think of.
I can't either.
I feel like I'm missing something because I was all prepared to talk about this, but it's been a long week.
It happens.
Brian, with respect to the building on Macomb Street you talked about earlier, so as that stands right now, remind us, we approved it as a mixed residence and plumbing office,
Correct.
and approved parking and entrances and ingress, egress, and all that stuff with that in mind.
Yep.
They are proposing an alternative use. Do we know what the alternative use is?
Well, how far along they've actually gotten, I couldn't tell you. What they made the inquiry about was sort of a, best I can equate it to is their takeout dessert shop kind of a thing. And so automatically what that did is by going into a kind of quasi-restaurant category, the amount of parking increased per your ordinance. The amount of parking required increased per your ordinance, which leads them to need to modify their plans. So that use, changing to that use, has kind of a domino effect on the rest of the site and how it's designed. So that was the last thing we heard from them. I know they were looking into a lot of different options, up to and including maybe sharing parking off-site somewhere. It is in Macomb Street, so we do have some flexibility for that. But again, the way the site plan was approved, that a change in use to a more intensive use is not something that will just be allowed administratively. It's going to require an amendment to the plan, and it's going to have to come back before the commission. Now, if they continue with the way it was approved, they're A-okay to move forward, and there are allowances in the ordinance for changes in use to sort of equal or lesser intense uses. So something that was similar to they could potentially, utilize the same approved site plan. But, anything that happens at that site will obviously keep you all apprised. Yeah, we've not heard. We'll probably, my guess is at this point in the year, we'll probably let that sit for this year unless they reach out to us again. And then we'll reach out to them after the new year to try to pick things back up.
Okay, very good. Any other questions for Brian on project topics? Then let's talk about the next meeting date. At this point, it strikes me that probably February sometime would be most appropriate. Can we get a calendar out and let's take a look?
The first Monday is the February the 6th,
Now, that won't work for me.
and then
Fifth.
I'm sorry, yeah, that's the 6th, and the last one is the 27th. Oh, no, wait, I'm in 2017, sorry.
The 5th and the 19th?
I would say that the 19th probably makes the most sense, given that there's nothing definitive on the project side. Give ourselves time to work a little bit on the Bayview.
That's the President's Day.
The 19th is President's Day. Is that an issue or no?
Is that a holiday for the township?
I think so.
It is?
And
Oh,
that's
my.
a problem.
No comment.
You don't mind coming in, do you?
Okay, what, let's back up to late January. What's,
I think that's a no, Jay.
how about late January? What do we have for a date there?
You can't do the 12th. What's the 12th?
Be the fifth Monday, maybe?
The 29th is the 5th Monday.
Right, yeah, there's a 5th Monday in January, the 29th.
29th? I'll tell you what, let's, how's everybody look for that? Let's make that tentative and, but recognize that we may choose to back it up if we need to. But let's keep that open on the calendar, kind of go from there. Okay, anything else anybody has that they'd like to discuss at the moment? Hearing or seeing no hands, entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you very much.